So the talk I'm giving tonight is called Alberta Independence is the Way to Preserve What Was Best About Canada. Now, Canada was once a very great country. For its first 100 years or so, Canada was known for exceptional national projects. Like we put a railway across the northern part of our continent. We took a wilderness here and settled it and built a community here and a country here with right out of a wilderness. I mean, we did major things as a country. We were known for this, and our military was known internationally, for the prowess it did in World War I and World War II. We were a great country. We had much to be proud of in our first 100 years. But since the 1960s, this has changed. Liberal leaders decided to remake Canada into a different kind of country, one that prioritized leftist social engineering over the country's historic identity and achievements. This transformation was criticized by real Canadian patriots. Like many Canadian patriots realized what was going on, what the Liberals were doing, and one of the best critiques was offered by Ted Byfield of Alberta Report magazine. Ted Byfield originally grew up in Toronto, and he moved out west and became a fervent Alberta patriot, like many people from Ontario who have moved here. Now, when Byfield was growing up in Toronto, Canadians still thought of themselves basically as British North Americans. He talked about how Canada's flag at that time was essentially the Union Jack. And the Union Jack consists of three crosses: the cross of St. George from England, the cross of St. Andrew from Scotland, and the cross of St. Patrick from Ireland. So that flag is an explicitly Christian flag. So Canada had an explicitly Christian flag. That was part of our identity. But in 1965, Prime Minister Lester Pearson replaced that flag. So we replaced the Christian symbolism of our flag with the maple leaf, which is essentially a pantheistic symbolism of a leaf that doesn't grow in Western Canada, like a tree that doesn't grow in Western Canada. So the change in the flag was symptomatic of a larger movement away from Canada's original identity. We were moving away from our original identity when we switched the flag. Now, one of the results of the decline in Canadian identity was an increase in the rise of regionalism. Like we had less of a national identity, and so people will identify more with their region. Like I know there's been critiques of regionalism. Why do Canadians look to their region when they should be looking to the nation? But as the government attacks the national identity, people naturally rely on their region rather than the country as their main source of identity. So Canada's cultural identity was being suppressed, and there was nothing else to replace it except for our region or our province. Now, this is a very important point because some Albertans have been, criticized as if we were disloyal to Canada, and we're not being disloyal to Canada. Albertans who support independence are often those who remember and deeply love the Canada that existed before the Liberals wrecked it. So, by 1980 already, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau was ruining our country and making fundamental changes to it. And by that time already in 1980, Ted Byfield recognized that there were two Canadas, Old Canada and New Canada. Old Canada, he said, was created essentially by Sir John A. Macdonald and endowed with a constitution, in the late 1800s. And then New Canada was being created by Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau and was endowed with a new constitution in the late 1900s. So we have two different countries, two different constitutions. And there are certain practical outworkings of these two Canadas. And I just want to quote from Ted Byfield as he describes these two Canadas. Old Canada had some harsh laws, but was safe to live in. New Canada has enlightened, lenient laws and is increasingly unsafe to live in. Old Canada was generally committed to the free enterprise system, modified where necessary. New Canada is increasingly committed to the socialist system, magnified where unnecessary. Old Canada met its military obligations, in fact served magnificently in 2 world wars. New Canada has virtually no army and has reneged on its military obligations. Old Canada was frugal and poor but paid its way. New Canada runs at a $14 billion deficit. Of course, $14 billion, that's 1980, so it would be much bigger by today's dollars. Now, these are two very different countries, right? Two very different countries. So the question is not, are you loyal to Canada? The question is, to which Canada are you loyal to? That's actually, and this is a quote, again, another quote from Ted Byfield, bringing this very question to the fore. When people put the question, are you loyal to Canada? I have to ask, to which Canada? The one that we used to know, or the one Mr. Trudeau is forcing upon us? I certainly felt part of the first, but that country doesn't seem to be there anymore. About the second, I have grave doubts. So it's not a question of being disloyal to Canada. It was a question of determining which Canada you're being loyal to. Now, our national identity was constantly under assault from Pierre Trudeau, but to be loyal to Pierre Trudeau's new Canada was to be disloyal to the old Canada, the original Canada. And Pierre Trudeau transformed Canada into a different kind of country, one that is no longer recognizable to most of us, or to many of us. So how did Trudeau transform Canada so badly? Well, if you want to change a country, you want to change its constitution. When you change the Constitution, you change a country, because the Constitution is the foundational document that essentially establishes the country and determines, the different roles of the government, the different governments that are there, the roles and the identities of the people, the roles of the people, their rights and responsibilities. So when you change the Constitution, you change the country. And that's something that Pierre Trudeau understood very well. He didn't like old Canada. He wanted to change it, and that was his motivation for changing our Constitution. In 1968, when Pierre Trudeau was Justice Minister, he put forward his first proposal for a Charter of Rights. And that proposal for a Charter of Rights was published by the Government of Canada when Pierre Trudeau was Justice Minister in 1968. Now, what Trudeau was proposing was that we'd have a constitution that would guarantee our rights, because our rights at that time were not explicitly enumerated in the Constitution. Like, there are different ways of protecting rights in the Western tradition, in the Western philosophical tradition. The Americans have explicitly enumerated rights in a Bill of Rights, and Canada and the British system did not. But so Trudeau would say, well, if you don't have them in a constitutional document, those rights are not guaranteed. Well, they were guaranteed. We just did it differently in the British system than the American system. But Trudeau had an easy sell to the Canadian population. He said, don't you want your rights protected in the Constitution? Like, who's going to say, no, I don't want my rights protected in the Constitution? So we had an easy sell. It was easy to convince most Canadians that they needed their rights to be enumerated in a Constitution to change more to the American kind of system. So, but like I said, Canadians' rights were, already protected. When you think about it, in 1968, when Trudeau brought forth this proposal for the first time, there was no country in the world that protected the rights of individuals better than Canada. There might have been other countries that are as good as Canada, but there wasn't a single country that was better than Canada in protecting its rights. We did not need a Charter of Rights, but Trudeau was able to convince Canadians, for most of them, that that was something that we needed. Now, when the Charter was adopted in 1982, the governments of Canada were given 3 years to bring their laws into conformity with the Equality Rights section before the Equality Rights section came into effect, because they didn't want, if the whole Constitution was suddenly brought into, or the Charter was made completely in effect in 1982, there'd be all kinds of laws that the governments had that were in conflict with the Charter. Those governments were given 3 years. Bring your laws into conformity with the Charter, and then when 1985 comes along, it comes into effect, we won't have all these court cases. So in 1985, our Justice Minister was John Crosbie, from the Progressive Conservative government. Mulroney was the Prime Minister. John Crosbie was the Justice Minister, and he was the one overseeing this. The Charter was coming fully into effect in 1985, and this is what he said to Canadians, just as the Charter was coming fully into effect. The public does not realize that we already have had a revolution in Canadian society. The adoption of a charter was a revolution. It has changed the whole power structure of Canadian society. It has taken tremendous power from governments and given it to the courts of Canada, the Supreme Court of Canada, which is not widely realized. Therefore, we are in a whole new legal environment in Canada. There has been a revolutionary change. There's been a revolutionary change. That's what our Justice Minister said as the Charter was about to take full effect. So who told us that if we adopted a Charter, we were going to get revolutionary change? Like, nobody told us that. They told us that after. No, over the next few years, many laws and policies have been struck down as a result of the Charter. What the Charter delivered was a fundamental restructuring of this country, not so much the grounding of our rights. Now, Dr. William Gardner in 1994 wrote that the Charter of Rights was, quote, an entire state enterprise for the reshaping of Canada. And he went on to say that Pierre Trudeau viewed the Constitution, quote, as a means to the achievement of some ideal state, an instrument for forcing society into a predetermined social and political mold. Now, and this is essentially what Pierre Trudeau achieved. With his so-called Charter of Rights, he essentially refounded Canada as a different country, one that fit his ideological program. Each and every day, courts across Canada enforced Trudeau's vision using his Charter of Rights. In this sense, Pierre Trudeau rules Canada from the grave. He's been dead for 25 years, but his ideology continues to reshape this country. And I got a really good example of that, actually, just from the National Post last week on January 29th. This is a column by Ted Morton. Now, Ted Morton was a political scientist at the University of Calgary for several decades, and then he was also a cabinet minister in Alberta's government. So this is from January 29th. The Charter is gutting the provinces, and the data proves it. This is a column about the study that was done by the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. So what's happening is, as various court cases come to the Supreme Court of Canada, and those court cases like challenging provincial laws, the Supreme Court is often striking down provincial laws. So what's happening is, over time, provincial rights and responsibilities are being eroded by the Supreme Court as a result of the Charter of Rights. So even though Trudeau's been gone for 25 years, he's been dead for 25 years, every year provincial responsibilities and rights are being eroded by the Supreme Court on the basis of his Charter of Rights. So our country continues to decline as a result of the Charter of Rights. Our provinces are losing their rights and powers as a result of the Charter so many years after Trudeau himself has died, and that's part of his ideological program. Now, one other aspect to the Charter that needs to be pointed out is how it has removed Christianity from Canada's public square. Like before 1982, there are many evidences or many policies and laws in Canada that were explicitly Christian policies and laws, and these began to be struck down as a result of the Charter. Although Canada did not have an established church or anything like that, there was a positive relationship between the government and Christianity. In fact, some of the maritime provinces, in particular Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island, they had Protestantism as an established religion in those provinces and those colonies at the time. Also, Lower Canada and Upper Canada, which is Ontario and Quebec, they had what was called clergy reserves, which was land set aside by the government for the support of Protestant clergy. So we had this stronger official relationship between Christianity and the government. Also, in 1906, Canada's Parliament passed the Lord's Day Act to enforce the Fourth Commandment. Like there were certain business activities and recreational activities could not be done because of the government supporting the Fourth Commandment. And also, of course, many of our public schools had Bible reading and prayers in them, and sometimes even the teaching of Christianity. And some city councils would open their council meetings with saying the Lord's Prayer. But Pierre Trudeau did not like these kinds of things, as you can imagine. And so with the Charter coming in, these things were struck down. So first in 1985, with the Big M Drug Mart decision, the Lord's Day Act was struck down, made of no effect. A few years later, in some Ontario Court of Appeal decisions, prayers and Bible reading were put out of public schools in Ontario, and that decision influenced other provinces. And also the teaching of Christianity in public schools in Ontario, which happened in some public schools, that was also struck down. Then a few years later, the idea of opening town council meetings with the Lord's Prayer, that was all struck down. And these were all the result of Trudeau's Charter of Rights. So in adopting the Charter of Rights, we were pushing Christianity out of its official relationship with government, like out of the public square in many respects. So Pierre Trudeau changed Canada into a different kind of country. Then, of course, we have Justin Trudeau, who shortly after he was elected in 2015, he was interviewed by the New York Times, and he told the New York Times that Canada has no core identity, that Canada is the first post-national state. And the New York Times pointed out that in saying these things, Justin Trudeau was the avatar of his father's vision. He was carrying forward his father's vision. This is the whole idea of the Trudeau Project, to eliminate Canada's national identity, to wipe out our identity, our historical identity, and replace it with abstract universal concepts. Diversity, tolerance, equality. That's what replaces our true, actual national identity. But many people in Canada still remember Many people in Canada still remember the old Canada and what it meant. We want our country back. That is why we support Alberta independence. Good old Canada has vanished. In its place, we have new Trudeau Canada, which reeks of wokeism, socialism, and an emerging police state. But an independent Alberta can and will uphold the noble traditions and freedoms of the original Canadian dream. Thank you.